I'm Bob Menendez, and I approve this message.
This morning, we hear from the senior senator from New Jersey who's in the political battle of his life in a campaign focusing on negative attack ads, corruption versus greed. Here, where Senator Menendez stands on the issues.
Now, from 42nd and 2nd, this is PIX11 News Closeup with Marvin Scott.
Good morning, everyone. You know, one of the hottest political races this fall is also one of the most contentious, with both sides slinging negative attack ads at one another. 13-year incumbent Democratic Senator Bob Menendez charging his Republican opponent, former pharmaceutical executive Bob Hugin, with greed and putting cancer patients at risk, while Hugin asserts Menendez is corrupt and should be denied the Senate seat. The senators' once double-digit leads have evaporated, and the race is now quite competitive. Hugin's camp claims it's a dead heat, while the senator's campaign maintains he's holding a comfortable lead. Last week, we heard from Republican Bob Hugin. This morning, I'm pleased to welcome New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez. Thanks so much for coming in. The New Jersey race should be a given. It's a Democratic, it's one of those bluest states there are out there with 900 more Democrats than Republicans. But you are facing, hanging over that cloud of corruption, and the message that is resonating with voters right now is being put out there by you. How are you going to overcome that?
Well, Marvin, first of all, it's good to be with you. And secondly, look, the reality is that when you have a multimillionaire who made his millions by making a killing off of cancer patients, who is focused on an absolutely negative campaign, hasn't told New Jerseyans what he'll do for them if he were to be a United States Senator. And he's doing that because he's hiding behind that money and that negativity to obscure what he did to cancer patients, how he preyed among the most vulnerable, and what he did in response to a federal suit that alleged Medicare, Medicaid fraud, VA fraud, taking patients and putting them at risk, not disclosing fatal potential side effects of his drugs. And ultimately, he and his company paid $280 million in settlement. So that's why Bob Hugin is being so negative. Well, we want to talk about how do we make New Jersey more stronger economically? How do we create more health care for our families, as I've done under the Affordable Care Act? How do we ultimately make sure our kids graduate from college without a mountain of debt? And so many other things that make a difference to average working class families.
I do want to hear about that from you in a moment, Senator, but let's get over this cloud. Let's talk about, I mean, we heard these charges from you and your campaign commercials, and we hear the charges from Bob Hugin about you. You had a hung jury in your corruption trial, but yet you got a stiff rebuke by your colleagues in the United States Senate because of accepting gifts. And that is something, you know, you say something often enough as he's hammering away in those negative ads, people believe it. Before you answer that, let's take a look how the two of you are going after each other in these ads.
Bob Hugin's company was sued for putting cancer patients in danger by hiding information about potentially fatal side effects. Putting cancer patients in danger by hiding potentially fatal side effects. Hugin's company was sued for being deceptive and dangerous. They settled by paying $280 million, misleading cancer patients, misleading voters. Bob Hugin will never be on our side.
Under Bob Menendez, for every tax dollar New Jersey sends to Washington, we get back only 77 cents, dead last in the country. Menendez spent 30 years in politics serving his donors, living large, getting indicted by Obama's Justice Department, and found guilty of breaking the law by the Senate, while New Jersey got screwed. Bob Menendez failed on corruption, failed as our senator. Send in a Marine.
I'm Bob Hugin, and I approve this message.
I asked Hugin to defend himself against your assertions against him. How do you defend yourself against his assertions?
Well, Marvin, first of all, a federal judge exonerated me of the most significant charges. 11 out of 13 average New Jerseyans on a jury dismissed the entire government's complaint. Several of them criticized the government for bringing the case. And lastly, a Republican Justice Department dropped the charges. The reality is that Bob Hugin is fixated on this because he is a one-trick pony. He is so ultimately out of sync with New Jersey values, as is evidenced by his support of Chris Christie when he was running for president, then Donald Trump, where he gave $100,000, where he was his finance chair, supports his Supreme Court nominee, gives $500,000 to a right-wing organization like the Heritage Foundation that opposes everything we believe in New Jersey, such as a woman's right to choose, that opposes when I was fighting for $60 billion for recovery from Sandy, the worst natural disaster in the state's history, successfully. The Heritage Foundation that he gave that money to was opposing using federal dollars for disaster relief. It's the Heritage Foundation that doesn't believe in marriage equality. All of the things that New Jerseyans value, Bob Hugin gave an enormous amount of money to individuals and entities that ultimately oppose those views.
You talk about the judge exonerating you, a jury was a hung jury, yet your colleagues in the United States Senate gave you a very strong rebuke for accepting campaign contribution and gifts from your friends.
No, you're wrong. Never about campaign contributions. They don't have any jurisdiction.
It was ethics.
And besides, the bottom line is we made some mistakes about disclosure issues. And even before the Ethics Committee decided several years ago, when Republicans first brought this complaint in 2012, and even before the government was ever involved, we corrected our mistakes. And the reality is that what I've never been mistaken about is who I'm fighting for in New Jersey. I'm fighting for working families. I'm fighting for health care opportunities, educational opportunities, to grow an economy, not for the richest in our nation, but for middle-class working families.
It does appear, Senator, that ethics has become the top issue in this campaign, as reflected by the campaign ads both of you are putting out there. You've gone through a tough legal saga. How has this impacted your image out there? Your polls are not showing the way they did 6 years ago when you had a 20% lead. They've narrowed greatly right now.
Well, look, Marvin, anyone who spends $20 million on negative advertising, I could take you, and you have a great reputation, if I spend $20 million with false and deceptive claims about you, at the end of the day, you're not going to look as good. The reality is that we're in a great position in this race. I look at that Quinnipiac poll that came out 2 weeks ago, had us up by 6 points. So I looked at that same poll, Quinnipiac, August of 4 years ago when my colleague Cory Booker ran. He was only 3 points ahead of me, and his opponent, Jeffrey Bell, who ultimately was an unknown and spent no dollars, was at the same exact figure that my opponent is after spending $20 million. So we're in a good position. We're fighting hard, and we take no vote for granted in New Jersey, and I believe we're going to win the race.
Okay, there's only one thing I want to do here before we go to a break, because last week I asked the question your campaign asked of Hugin. I asked him if he has a question for you, so please give us this answer from his question.
Senator Menendez, you've embarrassed the people of New Jersey with your unethical conduct. What gives you the moral credibility to run for re-election?
Moral credibility to run for re-election is, unlike my opponent, who opposed women joining the Princeton eating clubs that was a gateway to economic future opportunities, who said about LGBTQ individuals at Princeton that they would never make it out of his eating club, who opposed the rights of women to join that and litigated it all the way to the federal court, who ultimately supports a president, and President Trump, that has gone against everything that New Jerseyans stand for, supports offshore drilling, supports reversing Roe versus Wade.
He asked the question of you.
Yeah, the reality is that the reason that I have that authority is I stand on support of everything. I've been a fighter for New Jersey, for the things that people in New Jersey believe in. I didn't rip off cancer patients charging over 200% of a drug that they essentially needed. If you're willing to prey on the most vulnerable at a time in which they're most vulnerable, it says a lot about what you do if you had power.
Okay, on that point, we'll take a break, come back. I want to talk directly more about the issue. Stay with us as we continue our discussion with Senator Bob Menendez. Back now with New Jersey Senior Senator Bob Menendez, who is seeking his, this would be the third term in the United States Senate, a tough fight against Republican Bob Hugin. We talked about the negativity. Let's talk about now the issues. What do you see as the most prominent issue facing New Jersey right now outside of the ethics issue?
Yeah. Well, look, it's about health care. Even though I helped write the Affordable Care Act, bought 1 million New Jerseyans health care coverage they didn't have, eliminated discrimination against 3.8 million New Jerseyans who had a pre-existing condition, some illness or birth defect that had denied them health insurance, eliminated lifetime caps on your health care policy, so if you had a serious illness, you were one step away from being bankrupt at everything you have owned. So we made enormous progress under the Affordable Care Act. We need to do much more. That's why I believe, for example, Medicare, buying Medicare at 55 should be an option. I believe in a public option in all of the exchanges under the Affordable Care Act. I'm working really hard to lower the cost of prescription drugs, unlike my opponent who just raised the cost of vital prescription drugs for cancer patients. That's why I support the CREATES Act that ultimately makes sure that generics can get to the marketplace, which are cheaper in nature. My opponent actually was called out by the Trump administration's FDA commissioner as having his company being the worst in terms of stopping generics going to the marketplace. So healthcare is really important. Taxes, undoing the Trump tax bill as it relates to the state and local property tax limitation, that's a huge hit.
Let's talk about taxes.
Yeah.
What are the factors that are contributing to the high cost of living in New Jersey? New Jersey is one of the highest tax states in the entire nation. What's being done to help the middle class in New Jersey? How would you improve the lives of those people?
Yeah. Well, from the federal perspective, because obviously a lot of this has to do with state issues, but from a federal perspective, number one is I oppose the Trump tax bill. Why? Because it gave $2 trillion unpaid for, which means we're just going to have debt on the next generation of New Jerseyans and Americans, to the wealthiest corporations in the nation. They gave them over $1 trillion of those $2 trillion. The companies have used $700 billion of that to buy stocks, not to increase jobs, not to increase wages. They took away or limited our state and local property tax deduction. I offered an amendment on the Senate floor as a member of the Senate Finance Committee to restore the state and local property tax deduction. Every Democrat in the Senate voted for it, to restore it. Every Republican voted against it. We don't need to send another Republican to vote against our economic interests. And we're working to make sure that we give tax credits to middle-class families so that they can educate their child without graduating under a mountain of debt.
Now, your opponent points out that of every dollar New Jersey gives to the federal government, it gets back only 77 cents, the least amount of any state. First, is that true? And if it is, why?
Well, it's not totally true because it doesn't take all factors in of all different sources of money, number one. For example, when I succeeded at getting $60 billion for the region after Sandy, when I succeeded in getting the highest return on federal investments on mass transit and highway projects for New Jersey, a state that's so dependent on that, it doesn't include that all in the equation. But it got a lot worse under the tax bill that my opponent supports because it took away monies from states like New Jersey. It was a huge hit on New Jersey, and it gave it to people like him, someone who actually, when he was the CEO of his company, parked $7 billion of his company profits abroad instead of bringing it back here to the United States because he didn't want to pay the taxes on it.
Your message that out there that you're talking to your constituents is protecting New Jersey from the Trump administration's policies, particularly dealing with the environment. What are you doing in that area?
Well, I succeeded in the past against the Obama administration when they were thinking about offshore drilling. We have one of the most incredible, important parts of our economy, which is our shore region, our coastal region, important to recreational fishermen and commercial fishermen, important to a multi-billion-dollar part of our economy. This administration that my opponent supported his election of is in the midst of trying once again to create offshore drilling, which I vehemently oppose and will fight successfully in stopping. This administration doesn't believe in that the nature of the storms we had like Sandy as a result of climate change. My opponent supports both previous candidates and the Heritage Foundation that doesn't believe that either. This administration doesn't believe that if you mess up, as companies did in the past, and polluted the grounds and waters of New Jersey, that you should clean up, that polluters should pay. I have fought to make sure that we clean up Superfund sites. So we are focused very differently in that regard.
Now, you've been quite vocal about your opposition to President Trump, and there is a lot of opposition to him in the state of New Jersey. Is this going to be the factor that's going to take you to the victory you're projecting?
Marvin, I think my victory is going to be I've been a fighter for New Jersey. In a state that has the highest rate of autism in the nation, I passed the major autism cares legislation that helps families who have someone on the autism spectrum that's doing the research to find the cure. When New Jersey got hit with the worst natural disaster in the state's history, I brought $60 billion to the region. When the federal government turned against New Jerseyans who had made valid claims because of the storm, I reopened their cases and got them $300 million. When 1 million New Jerseyans get health care today because of the legislation I helped write, when children under the Children's Health Insurance Program that I extended for 10 years under my work in the Senate get health care, those are the reasons that I believe New Jerseyans will elect me versus someone who ultimately preyed upon the most vulnerable at a time they needed it the most.
Talking about President Trump for a moment, let's talk about something very current and his nominee for the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh. I know you've been at the forefront of the fight against his nomination and elevation to the Supreme Court, and currently there is this message about sexual misbehavior when he was back at in college. How do you respond to that? Is he going to be defeated in his attempt to rise to the Supreme Court?
Well, I hope so. Judge Kavanaugh is someone who is supported by my opponent, says he would vote for Judge Kavanaugh if he was in the Senate. I oppose Judge Kavanaugh. I looked at his writings on the D.C. Court of Appeals, the second highest court in the land. His writings oppose a woman's right to choose. His writings would overturn Roe versus Wade. His writings do not speak towards marriage equality as something that we cherish in New Jersey. His writings say that the president is above the law. Well, I think that President Trump picked Judge Kavanaugh as his get-out-of-jail pass.
What about this woman coming forward before the Senate?
Dr. Ford.
Yes.
Well, Dr. Ford, has made a very credible allegation. We shouldn't be rushing to judgment. First of all, this nomination is being pushed within weeks of an election when President Obama had a nominee 9 months before an election. Republicans stopped it. It seems to me that we, number one, have been asking for documents we have been denied before this allegation. Now that we have this allegation, there should be a thorough investigation of it. There should be an opportunity for Dr. Ford to come forward in an appropriate manner, and then we can come to a final conclusion. But I don't know what the rush is to get this done before the election.
Why shouldn't it go to the FBI first to investigate this?
It should, because at the end of the day, if you just have a hearing between Judge Kavanaugh and Dr. Ford, it will be a he said, she said circumstances. There are other witnesses, Dr. Ford said, were involved in the incident. They should be interviewed. There's, contemporary notes of the doctor that she went to at the time that shows that this is a true statement. There are other witnesses that could be brought through. The totality for the highest court of the land for a lifetime appointment should be reviewed.
In the end, do you think he will be approved?
I hope not. I hope not. This will change the court for a generation, and it will change it in a way and take us to a time and place none of us want to go back to on civil rights, on women's rights, on equality issues. I hope not.
Okay, going to have more issues to talk about. Let's take a break. We'll be right back with New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez. Stay with us. Back now with New Jersey Senior Senator Bob Menendez, who is seeking his third term in a very contentious campaign. So contentious, right after this broadcast, after this taping, you're heading to Princeton. You have a press conference because you have some more information against your opponent. What is that?
Well, Bob Hugin attempted to stop women from joining the Princeton eating clubs, which wasn't about socialization. It was about economic networking. He said about LGBTQ students that they would never make it out of his club, meaning, it clearly was a threat that they could not sustain themselves.
So you're saying you're taking this in the Me Too culture?
Well, I'm taking it as someone who doesn't stand up for mainstream New Jersey values and who continued to take that view even after he left Princeton. He litigated the case into federal court all the way up to the Supreme Court, said that the woman who was pursuing her equal rights was a political fascist.
So you're saying those charges against him versus those charges against you don't make him qualified to run. He's saying you're not qualified to be the
I'm simply saying New Jerseyans will have to choose whether someone who fought against women's equal rights, whether someone who fought against LGBTQ equal rights, is someone who we want representing them in the United States Senate.
Okay, let's move on. Gun control. New Jersey has one of the strictest gun control laws in the nation. Why can't we get such laws in the United States Congress?
Well, because the NRA, of which I have an F record with, has enormous sway over so many of our colleagues. I voted for the assault weapons ban when I was in the House of Representatives. I support its reinstatement. We don't need weapons of mass killing to be a hunter. I support universal background checks, which means that whether you're seeking to buy a gun with a click of a mouse on your computer or at a gun show or at a gun shop, you should have to go through a serious background check that makes sure you don't have a criminal record, domestic violence abuser, aren't on the terrorist watch list, don't have a mental health record. And my legislation to ban high-capacity magazines, why does someone need a clip that ultimately allows them to shoot 50 or 100 rounds? Unnecessary.
Why don't your colleagues succumb to this and understand this with these mass shootings we have every week? We're hearing another mass shooting, more deaths in this country. There's need for stiffer legislation.
Well, as I say to my colleagues and I have said on the Senate floor, our hopes and prayers are not enough anymore. You have to prick the conscience of each and every one of you to understand that every time we see a mass shooting, we could prevent a lot of it, as certainly the type of death that we see, if we had these reasonable gun safety measures.
Let's take a couple of other topics. The opioid crisis, how we deal with that.
Yeah, well, this is a crisis that touches every New Jerseyan, every American. This is someone we don't know, family or friend or neighbor. I'm glad that I fought successfully for $6 billion, $3 billion a year for the next 2 years to help deal with the questions of recovery, help to deal with addiction, think about education and prevention. These are critical issues. We can't incarcerate our way out of this question, and we need to think of it as a public health challenge.
Do you support recreational marijuana being legalized?
I believe we should decriminalize it because we see a disproportionate amount of individuals, people of color, who get incarcerated for the same thing that their that their white counterparts don't ultimately get incarcerated for. And I've also supported medical marijuana for those who are very ill.
Now you're in a tough campaign. Are you going to bring in the big guns between now and November, like former President Clinton or Obama?
Well, we have Hillary Clinton coming in for us for an event in October. We have several other, I think, significant voices in our party who will be coming in, and I'll look forward to announcing them when we have them in.
Let me ask you about the Mueller probe. We've been hearing about it. It's been going on now almost 2 years. Mm-hmm. Should this end, do you think that there is still something there to be found, or has this gone on too long?
Well, if you look at how many convictions and guilty pleas the Mueller investigation has brought, you must say that there's substance there. I believe that we should let the investigation run its course and understand ultimately what happened. I have a real concern that even as we speak, Marvin, Russia is in the midst of engaging and trying to disrupt these elections, in addition to what they did in 2016. They're doing this across the world. I see it as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so I think the Mueller investigation should run its course, and then we should see what he has to say.
You're optimistic about your own campaign. Are you anticipating a blue wave in November?
I think if Americans and New Jerseyans want to put a check and balance on the Trump administration, I hope we'll see such a wave. Right now, Republicans have the House of Representatives, they have the Senate, of course, the president. There's no check and balances on his worst instincts, on his worst actions. We need a check and balance in our government.
Producer's telling me time's up. You got 15 seconds to finally get that word out to the voters.
Well, I thank you for listening today, and also, if you want a fighter for New Jersey on our health care, on our economic opportunity, or making sure there's educational opportunity, then I have proven that I can do that, and will continue to do that for you every day I fight in the United States Senate.
You made it in 15 seconds.
Pretty
okay,
good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you.
And we hope to see you back here on Closeup.
Absolutely.
And that'll do it for our program this week. If you have any comments or wish to see this broadcast again, log on to our website at PIX11.com/newscloseup. I'm Marvin Scott. Thanks so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, everyone.